again, as we have for the last many days, to discuss a greater Miami history topic. And today we've got a really fascinating one. A lot of you all have knowledge of it, and I want to get a little deeper into it today, and that is the Art Deco District and some of its many elements, including those who helped turn it around to what it's become in the last 3 decades or so. So please tune in and join me. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I think we're good to go. I put together an outline today just so I could keep myself kind of on track because there's so much to this that I want to discuss with you. And I thought the first thing we'd do is just look at I as a native Miami, even though I was away for a long period of time when I was in graduate school and teaching elsewhere in the 70s and 80s. I just wanted to share with you some of my recollections of South Beach as a boy. I remember so well the pier that stood immediately east of what's Biscayne Street, in other words, near the Nikki Beach complex of today, and how active that was. And then it all went down, of course, by the early 1980s. But also, that area of Miami Beach was really the hangout for kids of my era, going back to the 60s and even into the 1970s. That was the beach where everybody kind of came to. And one of our curses were parking meters. But there was also that huge clock on a building built in 1958 on the northeastern corner of the mall part of Lincoln Road. And you could always look at that clock to determine how much time you had left on your parking meter. So there were some really quaint things about the beach. The dog track was just west of where the hangout was, our beach hangout was. Years later, in the 1970s, for a brief period of time anyway, I parked cars at Joe's Stone Crab, and at that point, Joe's was probably the only place that was really viable in that immediate area around South Beach. It was still booming at the time, a very, very busy place. Where else does a young guy get to drive a Ferrari from the door of Joe's to a parking lot? I want to look also, of course, at how the Art Deco District came around, how it happened. There was a building surge in Miami Beach, especially south of, let's say, 23rd, along Collins, along Ocean, along Washington, and then everything west of that would be residential, primarily apartments. And that building surge led to buildings being designed what we call the streamlined modern style of architecture, more popularly known as Art Deco, which was really a term that came out of a Paris exposition showcasing machinery and appliances of that era. The exposition was in 1925. It had, as part of its name, Artist Deco District, and that's where the term Art Deco comes. It's not really used in a big way until the late 1960s. So we can call it either way in terms of the designs of the building. Streamlined modern, Art Deco, sometimes nautical modern, because Miami Beach, of course, is so oriented around the water. And what we had was a building surge from about 1936 right up to our entry in World War II, which was, of course, December of 1941. And we had a small number of really talented architects who designed in that area of South Beach. Let's define it as the area from 23rd Street south to the tip, even though the Art Deco District stretches from 23rd on the north to 6th Street on the south, from the ocean on the east, irregularly all the way over close to Alton Road on the west. And these architects included Henry Hohauser, L. Murray Dixon, Albert Annes, Roy France, Russell Pancoast, and others. And they designed in this style. Now, what led to that surge of building, and Miami Beach was a small community. Its population of regular residential year-round people only reached 28,000 plus in 1940. But what led to such a surge in building and put Miami Beach among the top 10 cities in the United States in terms of the issuance of building permits in the last several years of the 1930s was that surge in tourism. There was the American plan that made it economical for you to stay in a hotel and get a meal as part of it. A lot of unionized laborers were getting brief but paid vacations. The economy was improving. It was still at 18% unemployment as late as 1938 in America, and then in 1939 it was full employment. The war in Europe, of course, sent a lot of orders for war-related goods to American factories, helping to account for that. During the war, we mentioned this before, we looked at World War II just the other day, Miami Beach became a large training ground for members of the Army Air Force. After the war, and even though the action had been in South Beach prior to the war, after the war, there's a tremendous expansion of hotel accommodations and restaurants and nightclubs and what have you, north of 23rd up to what we might call mid-beach, and then by the 50s into the area where the Fontainebleau is at 44th Street, all the way through the 1960s up into the 60s blocks and just about the 70s blocks. And South Beach in many ways was largely forgotten. A lot of the buildings weren't maintained very well. Prices for rentals there went down, and by the 1970s, it's become a haven for a lot of retirees, primarily Jewish retirees coming from New York and the Northeast. And there's a lot of poverty there by that time, and it's just kind of an isolated place for a lot of people. Again, the action is beyond there. In fact, by the 1970s, I would suggest that there wasn't a whole lot of action, period, on the beach. What was keeping tourism going wasn't really domestic tourism, but it was European, especially British, and some Latin American tourism. But a lot of businesses were in big trouble by the late 1970s. For example, the mighty Fontainebleau Hotel, probably the most famous hotel in the world when it opened in 1954, and in those years immediately after that, was in bankruptcy by 1978. To show you how the fortunes of the beach had changed in such a dramatic way in that period of time. So we have an elderly haven where the Art Deco District is today, clearly by the 1970s and well into the 1980s. Some of the movers and shakers of Miami Beach said, the way to break out of this malaise that we're in now in terms of economic problems on the beach is to redevelop the southern tip. And so they were able, from the early to mid-1970s, to come up with a plan to cordon off an area bracketed by the bay and the ocean on the west and east from 6th Street down to the tip. And they were going to create still another Venice of America, condominiums, townhouses. The marina that we know today on the beach, south of the 5th Street entranceway to Miami Beach, was a product of that. But very little else got off the drawing board. It was a huge project to canalize that area and hopefully resuscitate Miami Beach financially and otherwise. About this time, Barbara Kappenman came to Miami Beach. Her husband, Bill Kappenman, had an appointment at FIU, a brand new university opened up in 1972, and that brought her down here. She'd been down here as a youngster with her mom. Her mom was a sculptor, among other things. Barbara grew up in a family of very artistic people. Barbara was a journalist. Barbara was very, very interested in and studied very closely art and design. And they came back to the Miami area, and she wandered over one day and said, my words, "My God, all these wonderful streamlined buildings are still standing." She suffered a tragedy in her family. Her husband died relatively suddenly in 1974. She and her two sons then sought refuge away from everything, and they came up with a plan of action that Barbara would devote the rest of her life to meaningful things, to meaningful campaigns to make the lives of people better in different ways. She came back to Miami Beach and at that point launched an effort to preserve these great Art Deco buildings that were now being rented year-round for retirees and were not in very good shape. She organized, soon after she returned in the mid-1970s, something called the Miami Design Preservation League, and it was a band of, first of all, very small, and then it grew in numbers very well, a band of very determined people to preserve and to showcase and to fix some of these great buildings. She organized, along with other members of the Design Preservation League, including a man named Horowitz, who was very active with her. They created in 1978 the Art Deco Weekends, which began in late January each year and went from Friday through Sunday to bring more attention and more people to the area. She began to ally herself with a lot of very talented people who were also deeply committed to Art Deco in general, but also preserving that area and seeing that it became recognized as an Art Deco district. And their ranks included, we mentioned Mr. Horowitz already, who incidentally was a doorman at the Fontainebleau Hotel around this time. But there was also Nancy Liebman, Dennis Russ, Mike Knurk, Dennis Wilhelm, Matty Bauer, Ernie Martin, of course Tony Goldman, Jerry Sanchez, an early developer, Carl Reinhardt, Diane Camber, who headed the Bass Museum for many years, Richard Hoberman, who was a tremendous Art Deco guide at that time, tour guide, among other things, Neeson Kasdan, who later became mayor of Miami Beach, as did Matty, and many others. And please forgive me for not including everybody's name in this kind of countdown of people. But this group was able to secure federal grants to conduct a survey, an architectural survey of an area from 6th Street, where the building moratorium began, north to 23rd, to create, hopefully, an architectural and historic district in the area. And they began to survey the area in the late 1970s. They got state approval in 1978. The state then pushes on this application for National Register Historic Designation to the Park Service and the Department of Interior, and they anointed the district on May 14th, 1979, as the first 20th century historic and architectural district in the country. So you've got a district. Now what you need to do is bring in the investors in order to help you turn around this district. Not so much to push people out, but first of all, to fix up the buildings, to bring back those glowing designs of yesteryear on these buildings so people could really appreciate them. Later, local historic districts would be carved out of different portions of this National Historic District. You also had at this point tremendous opposition from developers who are now beginning to become interested, hearing all this noise about Art Deco in South Beach, not so much to preserve Art Deco, but to build anew over the falling bodies of Art Deco buildings. There's attempts at turnaround early on. Barbara was the sort of person, she and her two sons said, listen, if we're going to make a lot of noise about this particular district, we need to invest ourselves in it to help make the turnaround. And so the Capitans bought the Cardozo and several other hotels along Ocean Drive. In fact, they opened in 1981 a wonderful little hangout called the Cafe Cardozo, and it attracted writers and architects and artistic people to it. You could sit out on the porch, the veranda, and kind of probably reminisce about how things must have been back when this opened in 1939. The Carlisle next door, one of the grand hotels on Ocean Drive, also opened. Again, this was a Cappleman hotel for a while. It's Carlisle Grill. And so you had these little bursts of buds amid what had been an area that had been largely forgotten until this time. We mentioned already Jerry Sanchez as an early developer. In fact, there was even an attempt to open up in what had been the French Casino Theater, later the cinema, this jewel of a building that later became mansions on Washington Avenue, a club in 1982 by the name of Club Z. And this was really the talk of the town for a while before it had financial problems and closed. Efforts were made to make a go in the old St. Moritz Hotel, which was literally coming apart. The old Hoffman's Cafeteria, which became the Warsaw Ballroom, and other more chic clubs like Club Ovo. So there were these attempts in the early 1980s to begin to turn around through investment and through creative thinking parts of this district that needed a lot of help. I became a part of it in terms of being introduced to it when I was teaching classes of Miami history in the mid-1980s at the University of Miami and in Florida history. And I would bring groups over there, and you could see in the mid-80s, 1984, 85, that the buildings were there, but they were still rough around the edges. Different parts of the beach were spotty, really needed help. Some were dicey, but other places looked like they had a lot of promise. They just needed investment. And so those hints of turnaround for the beach began to increase by the mid-1980s for a host of reasons. For example, parts of Scarface were shot along Ocean Drive in 82, among the first of the turnaround elements of the area. Calvin Klein came along in the mid-1980s with his fashion photographer Bruce Weber. And he posed 4 males and 2 females naked, covered very heavily in oil, on the roof of the Breakwater Hotel for his new men's cologne Obsession, and that drew a lot of attention to the area. Miami Vice did a lot of shooting there and did a lot of work there to really enhance the looks of the place for its shoots. Andy Warhol made an appearance there. Christo and his wife Jean-Francois, they came there and they took over 6 or 7 hotels with their crew and reporters and what have you as they were wrapping the 11 surrounded islands, which appeared in Biscayne Bay, fully wrapped by the spring of 1983. So a lot of different things were going on there that really held, I think, promise for the future. And then the big investors started coming in, like Tony Goldman, who had an epiphany. Tony had a tremendous track record as a preservationist, as a businessman in old neighborhoods in Soho in New York, along Broad Street, south of Market Street in Philadelphia. He had come down to the Miami area, invested over $2 million in property in Coconut Grove, and under the exhortation of different people like Barbara Kaplan, he decided to take a ride over to this Art Deco district in the mid-1980s, and he came across the MacArthur Causeway, and he reached Fifth Street and Ocean Drive, and he took a left-hand turn moving north, and he had his famous epiphany. He said, "Oh my God, look at these buildings." He would then proceed to buy one of the first ones that he saw in the 600 block, which is the Park Central Hotel, designed by Henry Hohauser. And then he purchased many, many other buildings, primarily on Ocean Drive, but also on Collins Avenue. The Estefans came in as investors. Versace, of course, was an investor. Chris Blackwell of Island Records was an investor. And you begin to see great changes taking place. But I think that Tony Goldman in particular, because of his track record, really brought forth a lot of additional investors and investment in the Art Deco District. I think, just empirically speaking, the turnaround year for the district was 1988. And there's a couple reasons I would say that. One thing is, I remember wandering over there in 1987, and I came over to the Essex house. 3 Preservations had bought the Essex house for about $2 million. That's on 10th and Collins, designed by Henry Hohauser, 1938. And I kind of wandered in there, and everything was on scaffolds and what have you. And Patricia Murphy, who was one of the 3 investors, and she had run a bed and breakfast in Newport, Rhode Island, she was really extolling, the greatness of the building, how excited they were about reopening this in 1988. So that was in 87. I had a hint that, really serious things were happening. Came over there in 88, and I remember having dinner one night at the Park Central, and another time in 88, in July, I went over to the Clevelander. The Clevelander had been in ramshackle condition when I visited that earlier in 1986. I was doing some history work for Florida Power and Light, and I was supposed to meet a couple who were staying there. They were probably the only people in the hotel in 86. So I came back 2 years later, and lo and behold, the outdoor bar's there. It's a Saturday night in late July. The place is absolutely throbbing with activity. So I said to myself, things have really turned around in this area. And indeed they had in that transitional year of 1988. Within a year, Miami Beach had passed a bond issue allowing for the widening of the sidewalk on Ocean Drive, on the west side of Ocean Drive. So now you could put out chairs and tables and what have you and create a much wider promenade. Historic Preservation Board, which had already been underway since the early 1980s, was now looking much more carefully at everything. Ordinances were passed to preserve elements of the Art Deco District. A design review board was created, once again to assess whatever kinds of changes people came before them and were asking for permission to do. And then there was a ripple effect by the 1990s. Lincoln Road had been dormant. About 50% of its capacity in terms of its store frontage had been closed as late as the mid-1980s, but it's beginning to make a huge change in the 1990s. I think in large measure because of the great success of Ocean Drive. Same thing was happening on Ocean Drive as you move south of 6th Street, all the way down to the tip. It became a major thoroughfare there with a lot of new investment. We should note that among those who really made a big change, I think, in terms of bringing attention to the area and putting their money where their mouth were artists, never very wealthy, but at least occupying spaces, a large gay population, very, very intent on creating a beautiful district in that area. So you begin to see great changes taking place, and by the 1990s, the place is really on fire with, as I see it, not only redevelopment, it becomes one of the great places to be along the eastern coast of the United States, acquiring virtually worldwide fame, I would say, by the end of the 1990s. Now, I wanted to save a few minutes just to discuss some of my favorite parts of the Art Deco District. And I've listed among my favorites the Victor Hotel, who was named for the developer's Uncle Victor, who was killed along with other family members in a car crash in northern Florida before they had fenced in cattle ranches and all. A cow had wandered into the pathway of this car at dusk, and the car ran right into it and killed everybody. So Uncle Victor was honored with the name of that hotel. Another thing about the hotel that's so special is the great mural by Earl LaPon. Earl LaPon was a very prolific artist and sculptor, and he did that mural, and that hotel opened in 1937. I saw that in 1984 before they closed it. 20 years later, the Hyatt, which then owned it, reopened it. And I remember walking in there with some trepidation, saying to myself, God, I hope that mural's still there. Well, it looked as good as ever. And there it was, the Earl LaPon painting. I also love the Miami Beach Light Patrol Station, which was designed by Robert Taylor, who did Espanola Way. He did Espanola Way in terms of designing a sort of a Spanish artisans village in 1926. And here he is 9 years later designing, on a completely different motif, a boat. We've always said that Streamline Moderne was, certainly in its 1930s version, was really influenced by the great aerodynamic look of the machines of that era. And here we have a design of a boat to show you the influence of the machine over Art Deco design. I love Espanola Way, which was dormant as late as the 1990s. And again, that ripple effect from Ocean Drive rippled right through there and really enhanced that beautiful village. I love the Colony Hotel down on 7th, especially because of its green vitrol-like glass around the lobby area and along the stairwell that takes you up to the second level. I love the Betsy Ross, which is a total aberration designed by L. Murray Dixon in the late 1930s. There was a renewal of interest in, I guess, what you might call neo-colonial architecture in America. In that time, Howard Johnson was designing us motor lodges in that style and all. But what's also interesting about the Betsy is the wonderful care that the owners of the last 15 years have taken with it. And they've connected it with an orb, which is sort of like an Easter egg, a giant Easter egg, with the hotel immediately west of it, designed by Henry Hohauser, the Carlton Hotel. So you've got a really interesting complex there for writers, poets, speakers, what have you. I love the Cardozo Hotel. Again, that's really the beginnings of the turnaround for me. The Estefans bought it, have put so much money and TLC into it. I was in it with a tour group as recently as about a month and a half ago, and the lobby's fantastic, and it showcases through photographs the presence of Frank Sinatra, who shot a hole in the head there when the hotel was briefly renamed for the movie in 1958, The Garden of Eden, and he sang A Hole in the Head while he was there, or I should say High Hopes while he was there for that movie. I love the Miami Beach Community Church on Lincoln Road, designed by Walter DeGarmo, early 1920s. I just think it's a fascinating mission-style building that's been there seemingly forever. I love the Riley Hotel, which has been closed for a long time for restoration and renovation, but if you walked into its lobby of yesteryear, and I haven't been there in maybe 2 years, it looked like you're walking right into a 1950s living room with all these autographed photographs of people like Lucy and Desi and other major players in American entertainment who had visited that hotel probably at that time in the 1950s. I love the Essex House Hotel. Essex House, of course, is the one I mentioned before, the Henry Hohauser Hotel, that if you stand across the street diagonally across them, it appears to be the stern of a vessel. Just, I should say, the prow of a vessel coming right at you. And again, it's got a great mural by Earl Lapon, who did the initial mural in 1938. These preservationists found him 50 years later in 88, brought him back. He added an alligator to the mural. He was now in his late 80s, which I think is quite a story. He was up in Dania Beach painting at that point. So in the little bit of time we have left, I wanted to look at some of the questions. Julie says, I have a picture of the Colony Hotel in my living room. That's a beautiful hotel. Did Morris Lapidus design any of the hotels in Ocean Drive, or was it before his time? It was in some ways before his time, even though he lived to be almost 100. He really jumps into Miami Beach architecture with the Sanssouci and the Saxony, in which he was one of the architects for both of those. And then, of course, and they were done in the late 40s. Then he does the Fontainebleau in 1954, the Eden Rock in 55, and it just goes on and on and on. Julie Gautier-Tatel did South Florida experience an Art Deco style explosion in furniture production, metalworks, courthouse elevator doors. My answer to every design and fashions as well, my answer to each of these is yes, 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 yes. And this is really one of the great repositories in the world for Art Deco. Miguel Romero, was there ever a Saks Fifth Avenue on Lincoln Road? There certainly was. And it was really the talk of the town when it opened in the late 1930s. In the late 30s, Lincoln Road, which had been created by Carl Fisher, had begun to fulfill his prophecy as another Rue de la Paix, such as in Paris, with some great stores that were beginning to line the street. It wasn't mauled till the early 1960s. Ronald Reiser, any other murals in the Art Deco area? Well, there's 3 I'm aware of by Earl Lapon that really stand out. There's another great mural in the lobby of the Colony Hotel. It's a nautical theme to it. I think you'd really enjoy seeing that. Hey, Caesar. Howard Breyer At the time, there was a plan to totally redo the streets south of 5th, thus it was omitted from the historic district. Later, it became its own historic district, Ocean Beach. Thank you, Howard. It indeed became a local historic district. And once again, getting back to the moratorium on any building, change, demolition, whatever, from 6th Street to the tip, would leave that alone in terms of the Art Deco district of the late 1970s. Ronald Reisner, is it true that Barbara Chapman stood in front of a bulldozer that stopped the destruction of the Art Deco area? Yes, the Senator Hotel at Collins and 12th, which may have literally broken her heart. She died within about a year of that. Julie, I love the Art Deco buildings. I do too. Hi, Cynthia. Victor Vincent. Oh, one evening about 25 years ago, my brothers and I had paella on the veranda of the Essex restaurant on Cinco de Mayo. Fantastic. Yeah, it's just a great setting. And they always bring the best chefs to that restaurant. Hi, Irene. Julie, thank you. Hope Dr. George will do a feature on the Miami district of North Beach, including the legendary Deauville Beach Resort. Yeah, it's a great place. I hope to do it sometime. Megan, hi, Dr. G. How did the restoration of the neighborhood impact the communities that were living there at the time? That's a great question, Megan. And there was always that concern on the part of Barbara Kaplan and Leonard Horowitz and the other leaders of the Miami Design Preservation League. Where do these elderly people go if they're priced out? You know, gentrification before the term was really used in a big way. And many of them were relocated to areas on the west side of the island. Sadly, a lot of them, just through attrition, diminished in numbers by the 1980s as, you know, they left this world. We had a tremendous exhibition at HistoryMiami about a year or two ago on the part of two photographers, Andy Sweat and Gary Monroe, on the South Beach retiree population of the 70s and part of the 1980s. And I'm telling you, it was absolutely terrific. I took notes on it. I did tours of it. Really something. Tanya, so proud to be part of the Miami Design Preservation League with such a rich history and so many committed activists. You've said it all, Tanya. You can't improve on that statement. It's all true. Charlie Rabbins, why wasn't 5th to 1st included? Well, again, it couldn't be because a moratorium on any kind of activity, including designation, even though that wasn't really outlined in the design or in the redevelopment agency's plan, would have been prohibited there. Hi, Don. Victor, I remember the verandas of all the South Beach buildings filled with chairs and retirees watching life pass by. Indeed. Richard Whittington, hi, Paul. Do you have a presentation about the history of medicine in South Florida? My partner, Dr. Strait, would not forgive you if you don't. I mentioned Dr. Strait. I was talking about Dr. Strait in another context. He was a tremendous medical historian. Jill from Puerto Rico, hi. This is great. Hi, Marlon. Good luck and keep going after that commission seat. You have our support. Rochelle, hello from London. Oh, my God. This is great. Hi from Carol, and thanks again. Hi, Vanessa. Folks, I want to thank you all so much for joining me today. Time goes by all too fast. I have a good time each morning kind of putting this outline together. Sit outside by the pool, big yard on the side, so it allows us all to keep our sanity. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about Wynwood and its turnaround, and there's a very familiar name, Tony Goldman's going to pop up there in a very big way too. And we're going to talk about it in much the same way we talked about the district, that is, what it was like before, how the investment came in, the turnaround, the surprise on the part of many people that something like this could go on in an area that was largely forgotten by that time. So please join me tomorrow and have a wonderful day, and I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.